Good morning, everybody. I was interested to see that it says here, what I'm doing is a sermon. And I have to say, I don't get to be in places like this very often, but it feels good. You're good people. So Joe asked me to talk about hard work and love will overcome fear. So let me introduce fear to you first. I was watching just before Joe started reading the story to the children. Little girl sitting here with her mom, Paul and his granddaughter. And I was thinking, I have clients like that. They come from Central America, mothers and fathers with small children who have fled their country because it's not safe for them there for lots of different reasons. Economically, they fear violence, they flee sexual assault, and so they come here, or try to come here. And as you know, in July, many of them at the border were treated by our government in a way that we haven't treated people before. The little girl was taken away from her mom. The little girl was taken away from her grandfather and put in essentially a detention center. The parents were put in a different detention center. They didn't know where their kids were, and the kids didn't know where their mom or dad or grandfather was. And they were in there for months. I can't think of another situation that would cause more fear, especially for a child, in a place that's unloving, uncaring, where people won't answer questions, won't tell you where your mom or dad is, where your granddad is. So that's the fear that I see a lot of these kids facing. And because there are many organizations around the United States who do what we do at KIAC, a lot of those folks eventually got reunited with their children. We're working for several of them right now. So even though we would get a mom or a dad or a granddad released from the detention center in Tacoma, and eventually the child was released from what they call a shelter, and they were reunited, some of them are reunited in another detention center. And for those who aren't, they're living somewhere in our country right now, except for the parents who were deported before they could be reunited with their children. So their children are still here, and they're back in their home country, trying to figure out what to do for their child. This is not the country that I thought I was growing up in. I'm sorry. So, I have a friend who I met in the detention center last year, and I was lucky enough to be able to represent him. He had been beaten for years by gangs in Guatemala. So was his wife, so were his 3 children. They finally fled and came to the United States, and he was put in the detention center. And last November 30th, I was able to get an immigration judge to grant him asylum, and he was freed. But his wife and 3 kids are still in removal proceedings. And so they will continue to go through the process of going to court, and sitting in front of an immigration judge with me, and having us try to find a way to get them to be able to stay here and not be sent back to the violence that they fled. And there are hundreds of people like that here in our community, in Kitsap County, in Clallam County, in Jefferson County, the area that the Kitsap Immigrant Assistance Center covers. Many of them don't have someone to represent them. So I looked again at that little girl next to her mom, and I thought about the little girls 3, 4, 5 years old who get to sit in a different chair. They get to sit in a chair in front of an immigration judge in a court and answer legal questions for themselves because they don't have any representation. In our country, people who are in immigration proceedings do not get an attorney unless they can pay for one or they can find one who is willing to spend time and represent them for free. We also have what are called accredited representatives, people who can practice immigration law and represent people. That's what I am. I am not an attorney. But there aren't enough of us to represent all these kids, all these moms, all these dads, all these grandparents who need representation. So I will be in a courtroom in the detention center in Tacoma waiting to represent one person, and there are 50 other people sitting in that courtroom with nobody to represent them. And one by one, they go up and they sit in the chair. And the judge asks them legal questions. And they pretty much say, I don't know. And in many cases, the last word the judge says, I hereby order you deported. You're going back to your own country. There's no way people who come here fleeing violence, who barely speak our language, can represent themselves in immigration court, but that's what happens to thousands of them every day. Every day. 57 immigration courts around the country, packed full of people who are just trying to find a way to save their lives and save their kids. So, there's some good stories too. I guess in a way, even the stories of the people who are in proceedings, who I don't have a lot of hope to be able to gain asylum for, the relationships that I develop with them are loving relationships. I care about these people. They care about me. They tell me that all the time. And even though they come here seeking freedom, seeking help, and our country is treating them in a way that isn't showing them either one of those things, they still think this is a great place. They still want to be here. They still believe in the American dream. So, over the past 4 years, the Kitsap Immigrant Assistance Center has served about 4,000 people. Some of them have been here legally, who have green cards and want to become citizens, and we've helped them to become citizens. Some of them have been here, they've been admitted to the country, they want to get a green card, we've helped them to get green cards. Some have parents or children in a different country who they want to help immigrate to our country, and we help them to do that. We're mostly volunteers. We have 2 paid staff people, and we have about 75 volunteers. I'm a volunteer. I volunteer 60 hours a week, and I love it because this is kind of what your slogan says, making a difference in the world every chance we get. Well, there are a lot of chances in the immigration world, so we can spend lots of time doing good work for people. Last year, our volunteers donated over 14,200 hours to help people in our communities. So, I'll tell you the story of a young woman from one of the Central American countries She did not speak Spanish. She was an indigenous woman. She was 13 years old, and because of the situation her family was in, her family essentially gave her to a man who was 22 years old. He was a member of Marasava Truca 13. Pretty big gang in her country, in several countries there. And he told her he would give her cookies and chips, and he showed her some money and said, I'll be able to take care of you, I'll take care of you. Very soon after she was sent to live with him, he started beating her and sexually abusing her. And he did that for 2.5 years. She finally was beaten so bad that somebody found her in the street and took her to a medical clinic. And after she recovered, she decided she couldn't take it anymore, and even though she couldn't go back to her family because they would just send her back to him, she fled to the United States. She was 16 when she got here. She was 13 when she was given to this guy. So I met her in Forks, Washington, because we go up there and do our work there whenever we can. And for the past 3 days, I've been writing a brief to file with the court because I'll be representing her next week in her trial to be able to stay here with asylum. So I met with her on Friday up there in Forks, and she told me something that I hadn't known before, and that was she was pregnant when she was detained in the United States. When she came across the border, she was 8 months pregnant. And they kept her in the detention center for 3 months. So her baby was born in a detention center. He's a U.S. citizen, but he has an A number. I don't know if you know what an A number is. Every alien in the United States has an A number. It's kind of like our Social Security numbers. And that's how the Department of Homeland Security keeps track of them. So they gave a U.S. citizen an A number. Three or 4 years ago, if I was defending her in court, I would feel really confident that the judge is going to grant this young woman asylum because she met all the requirements that you need to meet for asylum. She was a victim of persecution for one of the 5 reasons that you have to be a victim of persecution for, and she feared persecution if she returned to her country. In June of this year, the Attorney General took one of the cases that was similar to this one and issued a ruling that said people like her who are seeking asylum really don't deserve asylum in our country. They're just victims of domestic violence, so we shouldn't be granting them asylum in our country. So I'm really sweating about what I'm going to do when I go to court this time. But that is just one example of the kinds of things that our current administration is doing to stop people from immigrating to our country or to take the people who have immigrated and send them away. So, if you recall a poem that Joe read, I want to suggest that each one of you get a copy of that poem and send it to your elected officials. And send it to the person in the White House with the blonde hair. Maybe someone will read that poem. Maybe someone will think about what we used to be and what we used to stand for. And we still do in many places, but in a very important place, I don't believe we do. And that is a dangerous thing for all of us. So last story. Another young woman, Central American, unable to speak Spanish, she spoke an indigenous language, fled to the United States because of similar situations, She was caught, but she was released, but she was put in removal proceedings. So we worked with her and were able to get her asylum, and she was able to get a green card over time. 2 years ago, she decided she would like to become a U.S. citizen. And so she started studying English and taught herself English. She had never been to school. There are 100 questions in the test for citizenship. And when you go for your interview, you have to answer 10 of them, and you have to get 6 of those right. But you have to know the answer to the whole 100 because you don't know what questions they're going to ask you. So I sat with her and sweated and watched her nail all 10 questions. That was at 9 o'clock in the morning. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I sat in an audience where people from 100 different countries were taking their oath of citizenship. I watched her raise her hand and say the words and walk up on the stage and get her citizenship certificate. And I cried. I cried my eyes out. It was like watching someone give birth, I guess. The first thing she asked me is, where do I register to vote? And she has come and volunteered with us to help other people who are in similar situations. Just an example of the kind of thing that people who come here want to do. They want to be part of our community, they want to be part of our country, they want to contribute, and they want to be safe. So there is a lot of fear in that community, but there's a lot of hope in that community too. These people are not victims, they're people who care. They're human beings like you and I. And sometimes I think doing this work, I should be depressed. And on occasion I feel as though my PTSD is coming back because of the stories I hear from the folks. But I have hope. I mean, being in a room with people like you, hearing you sing, listening to the words, it makes me remember we're good people and we'll overcome this. So thank you for your time.